So now in closing, let's look at these values in action. We will do this by looking at current regulations and controversies to see the real-world implications of these values. While we won't go through each piece of regulation in detail, I want to give a high-level overview of some of the regulations that can be tied to data ethics. I will then highlight a few specific examples. So first, we have the Common Rule. This was discussed in our previous video. It is a set of regulations that operationalizes the Belmont Report and helps control how human subjects research is conducted in the United States. There is HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. This federal law protects patient privacy, regulating how medical records and other personal health information, sometimes called PHI, can be shared. There is also FERPA, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, which protects the privacy of student education records. If someone is doing research on educational practices and outcomes, this law may come into play. There is also the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation. This is a law in the European Union that limits how companies can hold European Union citizens' data. If someone is doing research on citizens of the European Union, this law may come into play. Now, speaking more broadly, there are other regulations that can impact how we work with data. There are data breach notification laws. These laws requires companies to publicly share when personal data has been breached. These laws are intended to help secure our privacy. There are export control laws as well. I've only run into this once, but there can be limits on how we share data or information on something that can be used as a weapon, including biological weapons. And finally, there are contracts and research agreements. These are documents like data use agreements or other contracts that regulate how data can be shared, published, or used. They can be generated by grant funders, publishers, for-profit partners, and other research collaborators. Now, I'd like to give a detailed example of one of these regulations. I will start with the informed consent process as outlined in the Common Rule. Informed consent is the process of getting permission to perform a clinical or research intervention for a patient or research subject. In order for that informed consent to be valid, it has to meet 5 tenets. First, it must be voluntary. People need to be able to make their decision free of influence. Second is disclosure. The person must be provided with all pertinent information on risks and benefits of the intervention. The third is understanding. The person needs to understand the information provided. All information provided needs to be provided in plain language. The fourth is competence. The person needs to have the capacity to understand the information provided. And finally, consent. The person must actually consent to the intervention. These tenets are meant to ensure that people participating in research are fully informed about the risks and benefits of that research project, understand that information, and properly agree to participate. It is important to note that data sharing and its associated risks and benefits needs to be outlined in the informed consent process if any data can be shared outside of the study team after the study is completed. With all of this in mind, I want you to take the time to consider the following question. Which of the values discussed in the previous video, autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice, do you think is most relevant to the informed consent process? I will give you about 30 seconds. When I've run this class previously, most people say autonomy, and that makes sense. It is the informed consent process that ensures that people have the information they need in order to make decisions about themselves, their body, and their data. However, I'm sure you could make a compelling argument for other values as well. The second in-depth example I would like to discuss is HIPAA. You've probably heard about HIPAA. And the law itself protects patient rights to privacy, as well as how security and protection of PHI or personal health information needs to happen. I won't go into detail about most aspects of the law. Instead, I want to talk about how the law defines a de-identified dataset. Once a dataset is considered de-identified, the information in that dataset is no longer protected by HIPAA. So let's get into it. HIPAA states that a dataset can be de-identified in one of two ways. The first is expert determination. This means that a person deemed an expert uses accepted statistical principles to render the information not individually identifiable. The second is the safe harbor method. This means that a prescribed set of fields is removed from that dataset. In my experience, most people use the safe harbor method when de-identifying a dataset. So with this in mind, I want you to consider the following question. Which of the values described in the previous video, and again, that's autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice, do you think is most relevant to this aspect of HIPAA? I will give you about 30 seconds again to consider. I want to talk about why it is so important to tie our regulations to these values. And this is why I keep asking you this question. Let's get into an example. So this paper, Identification of Anonymous MRI Research Participants with Face Recognition Software, demonstrated that it is possible to re-identify brain MRIs that had been previously anonymized. They took a group of volunteers who understood the purpose of the experiment to see if they could reconstruct their faces from brain MRIs and then use facial reconstruction software to re-identify them. They were able to do so with a startling number of participants. Now, when this paper came out, a radiology researcher that works with MRI data got in touch with me about data sets she had previously shared. These data sets were legally de-identified according to HIPAA, but she was still concerned that they might have been re-identifiable. We decided that the data was not a danger, mostly because it was knee MRIs, not brain. But the researcher's concern demonstrates that this law is about patient privacy. It is about ensuring that autonomy. Even though the data would have been considered legally de-identified, she didn't want to do something contrary to those values. It is by tying our laws to our values that we can see situations where the law may fall short of what we expect from ourselves and from each other. Another area where we may see the law fall short for our own ethical values, at least for now, is in the use of AI in clinical settings. In 2019, Dr. Ruha Benjamin wrote an editorial on risk assessment algorithms and racism. Now, I know this is a lot of text, but I want to read it out loud to you and let Dr. Benjamin's words speak for themselves. She writes, Obermeyer et al. Report one of the first studies to examine the outputs and inputs of an algorithm that predicts health risk and influences treatment of millions of people. They found that because the tool was designed to predict the cost of care as a proxy for health needs, Black patients with the same risk score as white patients tend to be much sicker because providers spend much less on their care overall. This study contributes greatly to a more social conscious approach to technology development, demonstrating how a seemingly benign choice of label, that is health cost, initiates a process with potentially life-threatening results. Whereas in a previous era, the intention to deepen racial inequities would be more explicit, today, coded inequity is perpetuated precisely because those who design and adopt such tools are not thinking carefully about systematic racism. As you think about the situation as described by Dr. Benjamin, Which of the values discussed in the previous video, autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice, do you think were most violated in the creation and the implementation of this algorithm? Again, I will give you about 30 seconds. Here, I think you could make the argument that any of these values were violated by this algorithm. But personally speaking, because of how this algorithm impacted Black patients, I would say justice was most violated in this process. The risks and benefits of using this algorithm were not equally distributed across the population. To close out the background section of this on-demand series, I would like to highlight some takeaways. First, there will always be significant disagreement about these values, how they can be implemented in practice and regulation, and how they should be implemented in practice and in regulation. Next, tying a piece of regulation to the values that it is meant to protect can help us figure out if that regulation is adequate or if something new is needed. And finally, considering our values ahead of time can help give clarity to our approaches to future uses and future technologies like AI. Thank you for your time and for your attention.